This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek.
And the struggle over the monuments in the United States that are being attacked, in the effort to remove them, has raised the issue of what these monuments are and their role in American history. And today we're with Peter Rachleff, who is a retired professor in Minneapolis, and he has been studying the situation of labor, Black labor, and particularly the role of these monuments, particularly the Lee Monument. And he's written about it. And I think the American people, working people, really don't know the history of what happened with these monuments and what they were used for politically, and what happened in the fight against slavery and then Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. So welcome to WorkWeek, Peter.
Thank you, Steve. Delighted to be here.
So Peter, why don't we first start about this recent article you wrote about the Lee Monument and what was really going on with that monument, why it was set up, and the whole history behind it.
Well, I think it's important to have a framework that understands what we like to call the conversations between the past and the present, and that there are layers of the past that we can work our way through. And so as we sit in the summer of 2020 and look back at a monument that ostensibly commemorates the hero of the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee, it's important to zero in on the moment when that statue is positioned, which is in the spring of 1890. The Civil War had ended in 1865. And it's important to ask what was the function of this statue when it was placed in 1890. And it's a gigantic thing. It's 50 feet tall. It's made out of brass and granite. It was actually made in France and imported in a whole elaborate scheme of having massive participation about schlepping pieces of the monument from the dock where it arrived to the place where it would be positioned. And appropriately, and as a historian, I often struggle with whether the right word to use is ironic or appropriate for many of the things that we look at. And in this case, I want to say appropriate, that the statue was installed in a former tobacco field that had been the site of labor by generations of enslaved African Americans. And in what had been a source of material wealth was being transformed into a source of ideological wealth by the elite in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, of course, had been the capital of the Confederacy. But many people don't know that Richmond had also been the center of industrial slavery in the South, and that there were 4,000 enslaved men and women who worked in factories in Richmond, in addition to the tobacco fields around the city. And they made iron, they made flour, they made iron products like rails and nail kegs. They made granite, or they excavated granite and turned it into curbing stones. They performed a tremendous variety of industrial labor. And when the Civil War ended and those enslaved people gained their freedom, they began to organize unions and to organize, in many cases, together with white workers, particularly Irish immigrants, who worked in those industries alongside them. And that organizing reached a peak in the mid-1880s as part of a labor movement led by an organization called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor were all across the United States, the first labor organization that took in women as well as men, workers of color as well as whites, unskilled workers as well as skilled, And not only organized in the workplace, but organized in the community, and not only addressed issues in the workplace like wages and job security and work rules, but they also organized around issues like convict labor, and they also organized politically and organized for the 8-hour day across the country. So Richmond, what had been the capital of the Confederacy, became a center of a labor movement that was biracial, was multi-gendered, was acting not only around workplace issues, but also community issues, and at such a significant level that in October of 1885, the African-American leader of the Knights of Labor in Richmond was invited to introduce Terence Powderly, the so-called Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, at their 1885 convention in Hamilton, Ontario. And so Joseph Brown Johnson, who was a barber, traveled from Richmond together with his white counterpart, William Mullen, who was a printer, and together they introduced Powderly to the convention in Hamilton. And they did something very symbolically significant. They brought Powderly a gift, and the gift was a handmade gavel. And when they handed him the gavel to run the convention with, they explained that the gavel had been made out of 3 pieces of wood, one which had come from a tree which was cut down where Cornwallis surrendered to Washington at the end of the American Revolution, one which was cut from the lectern at St. John's Church, where Patrick Henry had slammed his fist on the lectern and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And the third piece of wood was cut from a pillar of Libby Prison in Richmond, where Union Army soldiers had been held during the Civil War. And these 2 Southerners, one white, one black, presented this gavel to Powderly and said this was in honor of the true patriots of our common country. That was in 1885. They returned to Richmond, where the Knights of Labor took up a remarkable fight to build a new city hall. And the Knights of Labor wanted this new city hall to be built on the 8-hour day, to be built out of local materials, to be built by local workers directly employed by the city, not employed through a contract system, and paying a living wage. And they wanted jobs to be made available to, in the language of the day, for colored workers as well as white workers. And they presented that as a petition to the Richmond City Council in early 1886. And the City Council said, we would be fiscally irresponsible to adopt a program like this. We're going to build this new city hall as cheaply as we possibly can. And the Knights of Labor said, we're going to create a third political party that stands outside both the Democrats and the Republicans, that we're going to call the Workingmen's Reform Party. And we're going to run for your seats on the City Council to build the City Hall that we imagine and desire to build. And in May of 1886, they swept control of the city government with African-American candidates as well as white candidates. They won that election in the city that only 21 years before had been the base of Jefferson Davis and the government of the Confederacy. Now, my point is that not only is that remarkable, but it's so remarkable that we have to ask, how come this Jewish guy from, at that time, New England, now from Minnesota, how come I know this story and nobody else knows it? How did I write a book that tells this story that is even available in paperback at a reasonable price and nobody knows this story? Why isn't there a plaque on the City Hall in Richmond, Virginia that tells this story? Why doesn't the Wikipedia page for the City Hall in Richmond, Virginia talk about anybody but the architect who designed the building? Why doesn't it talk about the workers who built it and how they got the job to build it the way they wanted to build it? And part of the answer to that, why is this story erased from history, is the monstrosity of this Robert E. Lee statue, which gets plunked down in Richmond, money allocated from the state government. The land is owned by the state of Virginia. The project is run by the state of Virginia with help from the Daughters of the Confederacy. And this monstrosity is created to enshrine the concept of the lost cause and to say to white workers who are moving in the direction of class consciousness and interracial solidarity, to say to them, hang with the powerful white people. The powerful white people will look after you. You will have access to privilege and advantage. Cut loose those Black people that you have been working with. And not solely through this statue, but the statue is part of really an ideological campaign that is used to pull white workers away from the African Americans that they had organized with and to solidify white supremacy in Richmond at a time when it was most at risk as a dominant ideology in a political economic structure. So don't you ask me a short question, I give you a long answer, Steve. But
Well, history is not simple. And
right.
the fact that people don't know this history in the United States, which is a very important part of history, is evidence that there are some interests who don't want people to know about this history. They still have an axe to grind. Now, the struggle of Black and white workers in the South does have a long history, and obviously this is part of that hidden history. Also in 1892, there was a general strike in New Orleans of Black and white workers. Why don't you talk about how the connection of the attack on Reconstruction and how that was connected to the fight to reassert the slave owners in the South?
Well, you know, I think as some historians have shown, the subtext to Reconstruction was the national economy. I studied with the brilliant historian David Montgomery. David's dissertation and first book, which was published in the late 1960s, was called Beyond Equality, Labor and the Radical Republicans, 1862 to 1872. And David, in that book, looked at how class conflict in the North led the elite, the capitalist elite in the North, to make decisions about Reconstruction that would reinscribe slave-like labor relationships in the South so that the northern industries could have access to cheap cotton. I mean, we can even back up another step and look at the global economy and the role that cheap cotton coming from the United States played in the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So access to cheap cotton, which was based on, at first, labor that wasn't being compensated at all, and then through the sharecropping system that was implemented during Reconstruction and the convict labor system that came along around the sharecropping system, that they enforced regimes of unfree, uncompensated, dictatorial labor that continued to make the raw materials from the South, first cotton, but also indigo, rice, sugarcane, tobacco, that all of these products fueled the American Industrial Revolution which fueled the global industrial revolution. You know, I think back, you and I probably read way back in the day Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, which was written in the early 1940s. And Williams, who became the first prime minister of the independent country of Trinidad and Tobago. But Williams wrote this book to argue that slavery was not some backwater in the global economy, that slavery and slave labor was central to the development of the global economy and the Industrial Revolution in particular. So there was a brief hiccup during Reconstruction. I've just been refreshing myself for a conversation we're going to have Tuesday at our East Side Freedom Library, and discovered that, for instance, that by 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, 80% of African American men in the South had registered to vote. It would give Donald Trump apoplexy to think about 80% of African American voters actually being registered to vote. And my research in Richmond, Virginia, taught me that African American women were active leading up to elections to make sure that men got out and voted, and also to make sure who they voted for. So though the women did not have the franchise, they were very politically active as well. So there are the economic issues of cheap labor to produce raw agricultural products that feed the Industrial Revolution. There are the political issues. You know, by 1877, by the end of Reconstruction, 2,000 African Americans had been elected to public office. Not just the City Council of Richmond, Virginia, but in some cases to the United States Senate, the Lieutenant Governor of Mississippi, Blanche K. Bruce, that African Americans were not only signing up to vote, but they were using the vote, and they were representing themselves in the political system. In the state of Virginia, in the mid-1870s, when the Depression of 1873 struck, and struck all across the country, in the state of Virginia, the government began to close public schools as a way to save money. This, again, is this appropriate or ironic? We learn that the government of the state of Virginia identified the largest bondholders, people owed debt by the state of Virginia, were British. And they had purchased Virginia bonds in the 1850s to fund public improvements like canals, highways, and bridges in order to move tobacco and cotton from the fields to the markets and to the docks to enter the international marketplace. Those bonds were 20-year bonds, and they were coming due in the middle of this depression. And the government of the state of Virginia, the governor, Mr. Kemper, the governor said, this is a matter of honor for the state of Virginia to pay its debts. And African Americans said, at the expense of closing our schools, that we finally have public schools, and now you're going to close the schools to fund paying off these bonds? And they organized a new political party called the Readjusters. And this was a kind of populist, largely rurally based movement in the middle 1870s. And they said, let the British come and invade us if they think they're going to collect on their debt. And the Readjusters said, we want to readjust the debt. We'll pay them 25 cents on every dollar, and they'll take it or leave it. And in 1879, they elected a governor. So there already was a third-party movement in Minnesota that included white farmers, African-American farmers, sharecroppers, urban workers, around ideas of economic justice and fairness, and ideas of enfranchisement using the political system to address the economic issues that people had. That also fed into what would become the Knights of Labor in the 1880s. So the white elite was shaking in their boots. How were they going to divide this movement? And you know, you mentioned the New Orleans general strike of 1892. I was thinking this morning, recalling the great book that I read when I was an undergraduate in college, Edward Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, which is about Bacon's rebellion of 1676, and a rebellion where enslaved people, indentured servants, united together in Virginia and burned down the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, in the capital of the colony of Virginia. And the response to that by the white elite, and this is a white elite that was in London as well as Williamsburg, and the white elite said, we have to keep poor white people and poor black people away from each other. We need to draw dividing lines. And Edward Morgan said this was the birth of racialized slavery in Virginia in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion. They shut down indentured servitude. No more white indentured servants. No more black indentured servants. Black people were slaves. White people were to be free. And that became the system in 1676. So again and again, divide and conquer was the strategy of the white elite. And in the interests of their own wealth and their own political power. And that got challenged in Richmond in the 1880s. And the response to it was material and symbolic and ideological. They used every tool that they could get their paws on, and ultimately funded this horrific 50-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee.
Now, this effort by the capitalists to basically put the blacks back in their place, and also to divide the blacks from the whites in the South, what role did the capitalists in the North have in that? I know that there was also a growth of the Ku Klux Klan, which was used to reassert racist system.
Yeah, I mean, there was in 1877, you know, there was the political compromise of 1877 that allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to be elected president of the United States by cutting a deal in a back room in Florida over Florida's electoral votes. And when that deal got made and Hayes became president, the final piece of that deal was that the federal government would pull any remaining federal troops out of the South. And so they did, and that allowed the Ku Klux Klan, that allowed various organizations and individuals, whether it was Pitchfork Ben Tillman in South Carolina, or Thomas Watson in Georgia, or any of these so-called fire eaters coming forward. There was no federal protection of the rights of African Americans in the South after 1877. And, you know, there had been this fight in Congress in 1875 when Thaddeus Stevens introduced a civil rights bill in 1875, and that was defeated because the white capitalists of the North, most of whom were Republicans, not Democrats, but they saw their interests in allowing the white elite in the South to restore order. I mean, it's sort of interesting. We're living in a moment where a lot of us want to argue about the word normal. What does it mean to say things were normal? Now we want to get back to normal. You know, is normal police brutality? Is normal a carceral state? Is normal inadequate health care for people of color? Is normal a largely deunionized workforce? So we can transpose that back to the South in the 1870s and late 1870s and 1880s and see that the capitalists of the North wanted to see the South return to normal. And normal meant cheap labor producing cheap raw materials that could then be engineered into the industrial revolutionary machine of the North. That was the stability that the capitalists of the North, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, that they wanted. And they got.
And this is systemic racism, which now is a major issue in the United States, that people are raising the fact that it's not isolated incidents. The murders of George Floyd or others is part of systemic racism, but also systemic racism in the workforce, and the exploitation and profiteering off of racist exploitation of Black and Latino workers. Now, you're saying that there was the Knights of Labor actually tried to develop a working class political party.
Yes.
That would unite the workers, Black, white, all workers, on a class lines against a system, a capitalist system, that really codified systemic racism. What is the relationship of the fight for the Workers' Party then and today in relationship to the fight against racism?
It's interesting. It pops into my head. You and I were probably both at the founding convention of the Labor Party. And of the wonderful late Tony Mazzocchi, and Tony saying, the bosses have two parties. Shouldn't the workers have at least one? And the remarkable and unfortunate thing that happened to the third party effort in Richmond was that it brought the Republicans and the Democrats together, because they both wanted to destroy this third party, that they saw this third party as a threat, not only to their political hegemony, but also to their economic power. And so each of them nipped away at this third party effort. And the Republicans, who might still have some credibility with African Americans, or that there were obviously layers of African Americans, and they whispered in their ears, don't trust this guy. And the Democrats went to the workers that they had some sway with, and they said, don't trust this guy, don't trust this party. They're gonna pull the rug out from under you. And the thing that I argued in my book, where I had more space to develop the argument, is that the Knights of Labor never succeeded in creating a cultural space where African American and white workers actually got to know each other, that they had a strategic alliance around building that city hall. They had a strategic alliance around putting down a convict-run barrel factory in the state penitentiary. They had a strategic alliance about the state not paying those British bondholders. But these strategic alliances were struck by small groups of people in small rooms together. And people did not get to know each other. And as I say this today to you, Steve, I'm realizing that that's, of course, what is informing the work that I've been doing for the last 6 years in creating this project in St. Paul called the East Side Freedom Library, which tries to be that very cultural space where people from different experiences, different backgrounds, can share their stories with each other and discover how much they really have in common, not necessarily around strategic issues, but around how they love their partners, how they love their children, how they want to see a world of peace and justice, how they want to be safe in the workplace, how they want to be secure in their old age. that these are things that whether you are Hmong or Karen or Oromo or Somali or European descended white people, these are things that people all share. And it's a capitalist system that tries to keep them all competing with each other on the grounds that there's not enough of that stuff to go around.
And one of the things that has shocked the not just the Republicans, but even the capitalists and the Democratic Party is this mass upheaval of young people, white, brown, Native Americans, all coming together at once to say enough is enough. And this mass protest movement, which in my view is going to be a prelude to the millions that will be on the street as the depression deepens and workers cannot survive, they can't pay for their homes, they can't take care of their kids, leading likely to general strikes and mass upheavals. This lesson from the Civil War and post-Civil War Reconstruction, where workers did come together and formed a political party, what relevance does that have today in the face of what is a catastrophic situation economically with the depression, with the pandemic, where you have disparity of treatment and the conditions of Black and Latinos, and a climate crisis, which is cataclysmic as far as the world, the future of the world and future of humanity?
I think that, I was amused ages ago. I was fortunate to hear Cornel West give a speech in person, and he described himself as a Chekhovian Marxist, which is not a terribly optimistic position. And I realized that I like to think of myself, coming from New England, as a Robert Frost Marxist. And that is, there are always two paths. And we have choices at the forks in the road, which path we're going to take. And if we don't have stories that tell us that at points in the past, people chose unconventional paths, and they chose them for good reason, and they journeyed some distance. So there is the path of solidarity. We live in a culture with whose dominant narrative, as Dave Montgomery used to say, is each for himself is the boss's plea. And then he would say, and unity among us is the workers' response. So solidarity has existed in the past. I think it's so important for us to tell these stories of solidarity, which have, of course, have been swept into the corner, have been silenced. I think of Marcus Rediker's wonderful work about the solidarities among white and Black sailors, and how that would be expressed in both mutinies and piracies, that there are many examples of solidarity, but we don't hear them. One of the difficult things about this uprising of a younger generation right now is the saliency of identity politics in the mix of this, and the idea that no one can speak for anyone else, that everyone has to speak in their own voice. And how do we learn to walk in somebody else's shoes? How do we understand how they see the world if we don't attempt to put ourselves in their place, in their shoes? So illuminating these alternate paths towards solidarity are absolutely critical. I mean, at the same time, in this moment that we're living in now, we have seen extraordinary behavior of mutual aid among young people. Now, as I'm nearing 70, I'm not out in the streets as often as I used to be. I'm on various text lists and email lists, and I see people caring for each other and expressing that care and sharing, are you at such and such an intersection? have you brought water? Have you brought food? What are you doing to help people who are there? And it's, it as Robin Kelly would say, this is the imagining of a different world, imagining a world where people actually care for each other and support each other. So that's present in this mix now as well. And people need to know that there were times in the past when people behaved this way and didn't only look after their own back.
So this class solidarity, uniting the entire working class, has a history in the United States.
Absolutely.
Which is important to understand today in the struggle that we're going through.
Yes.
And the other issue is what should happen to these monuments, because they are works of art, yet there have been used in the case of these Confederate monuments to resurrect the history of the Confederacy and the legitimacy of the Confederacy. What do you think should happen to them?
Well, I think they should all have interpretation, at least by them. Maybe they shouldn't be iconic and in public spaces. Maybe they should be in museums. We can't change the monuments without also changing the curriculum that kids are learning in school. And there are so many ways that we need to transform the stories that people are told. I know you had one hell of a fight in San Francisco about that mural in Washington High School and the representations that it actually shows the truth about George Washington, that he strode over the bodies of Native Americans and he enslaved African Americans. And yet there is the complicating reality that Black kids and kids of color who see those images feel pain and victimization looking at those images. So what do? We need to provide a better education overall in which the meaning of those images can be accessed and manipulated and engaged by people in their own time. It's not easy, and it begins by knowing what was the ideological reason for the creation of these images when they were created.
And of course, in the 1930s and the 40s, you had a movement of leftist artists, Victor Onatoff and others,
Right.
Zackheim, who were actually portraying the actual history of the United States, the actual class struggles. And they were controversial at the time because the right wing, the capitalists, wanted to take them down and destroy them. They didn't want these artwork that actually showed this is the reality of the history of the United States.
Right. We all grew up with that horrible portrait of George Washington in our classrooms, the Gilbert Stuart. And then when I got to college, somebody said, do you know why he has that look on his face? Because he had wooden teeth. Now I know, and they said, and because his teeth fell out because he had syphilis. Then I found out it wasn't wooden teeth. He had a set of false teeth made out of the teeth from enslaved people. George Washington.
They were taken out of their mouths.
Taken out of the mouths of people that he had enslaved and whose labor he had benefited from. This is not about gotcha history. This is about understanding what were the power dynamics in the past, and not only the evil deeds, but also those stories of solidarity, the story of Bacon's Rebellion, the story of the New Orleans General Strike, the story of the San Antonio pecan shellers, the story of the San Francisco General Strike of 1934. There are so many stories that kids do not hear. because they offer that alternative path that the capitalist elite wants everybody to believe there is only one possible path, and you're on it, and there isn't enough room on it for everybody. So you better stay on that path and throw other people the hell off.
And the rise of open racist, fascistic tendencies. Trump, today the troops are being used in, or agents, Homeland Security agents are being used in Portland to round people up. At the same time, the right wing are saying that their world is ending. They're losing the world. They're losing Portland, for example. They said today they're losing Portland. It seems there is from their point of view, their world is being destroyed. Do they have reason for that?
Yeah, I think that neoliberal capitalism has played out. And again, my Robert Frost vision, there's two paths. There's the path of Trump, Bolsonaro, the guy in Hungary, the guy in Poland, any number of authoritarians. And there's the path that young people are showing us in the streets, that they're showing with their art, they're showing with their practices of mutual aid, they're showing with their efforts to grapple with the hand that history has dealt them. There ain't no normal to go back to, and we're either going to go to authoritarianism, and there's only so much room on that ocean liner to be on, or we're going to go in the direction of a new kind of democracy and mutualistic community that's not only in Minneapolis, not only in the United States, but is global in many ways. That those are the choices that, as we look ahead, that we're going to have to make.
And obviously, it must be frightening to not just Trump, but the capitalist class, that young people, over 50% of young people, see socialism as a future for themselves. I mean, they don't really see having a future, a viable future under capitalism.
Yeah.
So that must really mean a shift in the thinking of young people about the ability of the capital system to provide a future for them and their families, and if they are able to have families.
Right. And I think that they need to be encouraged to tease out the structural implications of the activism that they're engaged in. And I think more and more are, and often at the leadership of young people of color, to imagine, okay, how could we provide health care to everybody? How could we provide housing? I don't know if you had heard the story, and this journalist from Mother Jones was here, and she wrote a wonderful story about it, an extensive story, that there was a hotel in the middle of the neighborhood where much of the violence and arson and looting took place in the couple of days after George Floyd's murder. And it was a Sheraton, and it was abandoned. And homeless people moved in and created a community in it. And they gave it a name, the Sanctuary. And at a distance, I had questions like, well, how did they decide who got which room? There were interviews on public radio with reporters who went into the place and talked about how they were making meals, that they were dealing collectively and democratically with their real material needs. And there was tremendous pressure put on the owner of the hotel by the local elite that he should get them evicted. And that he thought at first, live and let live. What else was sitting there? Maybe he'd get some good publicity out of it. But they put the pressure on him, and 2 weeks into the struggle, he sought an order to have them evicted. It's a great microcosm I think of B. Traven and Traven's novel, The Death Ship, and the way Traven would, we need a B. Traven to write a novel about that hotel and to get at the nitty gritty of how people live. Like, say, Sam Dolgoff's book about the anarchist collectives in Spain in 1937 and 1938. How people made decisions. And we see examples of that, real examples, not out of textbooks, real examples that people are creating.
And of course, those occupations took place in Argentina. After the collapse of the Argentine economy, the capitalists abandoned the factories, workers took them over, and they made them work. And I think today, facing a massive depression, the question of survival for people is going to be the forefront issue. How are people going to survive? How are people going to feed themselves, their families? How are they going to have housing? How are they going to basically make the system work that is completely collapsing on itself, this capitalist system?
Think of those General Electric workers, I think in Massachusetts, who said after they had been laid off and the pandemic set in, and they said, we want to build ventilators. Put us back to work building ventilators. And GE wouldn't do that. So, people like you and me, we're waiting for the day when the workers say, well, we're not going to leave it up to management to decide that we can be called back to make ventilators. We have the know-how. We know how to get the raw materials. We can make socially useful products to make other people's lives better.
Did you ever think that that would be the period where you would live through in the United States?
I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be here. Yeah.
For historians, this is an incredible time.
Yes.
In the history of the United States.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with Peter Rachleff, and he's a retired professor and a historian about the class struggle and black and white labor and its history, particularly in the South, and how workers in the South united, black and white, to transform society and also build a political party at the time to defend themselves. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek, Peter.
Thank you, Steve.